I'm like probably the most famous ghostwriter you've never heard of.
Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, a show that explores the journeys of some of the most interesting members of the Hamilton College community. This week's guest is Mike Barlow, class of 1975. All right, back for another one. And back inside the closet studio. You know, that's what I get. Trying to move on up in the world, trying to upgrade. Trying to take advantage of my home office. Decided to step up and try and convert the home office into the recording studio, and I didn't like it. It sounded echoey. I can't get rid of the echo in that room. So it's back into the closet studio for what is a fun conversation this week. Last week we talked to Sapphire Ruiz, the current Student Assembly president at Hamilton, and much of the conversation centered around the state of activism at Hamilton. In fact, they talked about the research project they're about to embark upon, looking at the history of activism at Hamilton. And this week, we talked to a guest who lived through a different time at Hamilton, where certainly activism was rampant in the country and cast a large shadow over his experience on campus. Mike Barlow, class of 1975, talks about, in this conversation, how the closing years of the Vietnam War cast a shadow over his experience. It's really interesting to get into that conversation. I first connected with Mike because of this show, and he reached out interested in starting his own podcast. You'll hear us talk about it. So it turns out all the times I've spent in the beginning of episodes talking about Buzzsprout, it worked. Because Mike called me up and said, hey, you talk about Buzzsprout on your show. What's it like? And now he's got his own podcast, Paid by the Word, which we'll talk about. So that's now two Hamilton grads who have embarked upon their podcasting journeys. So why don't you give it a try? Maybe you're looking for a new marketing channel for your business. Or you just have a message that you want to share with the world, whatever that may be. You have a passion you want to talk about. Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online and listed in all major podcast directories: Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, the list goes on. They got you covered. You can be in all of those within minutes after finishing your first recording. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and the team at Buzzsprout is passionate about helping you succeed. So join over 100,000 podcasters like me and this week's guest, Mike Barlow, who are already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. Following the link in the show notes lets Buzzsprout know we sent you. And if you sign up for a paid plan, you're going to get a $20 Amazon gift card. And you'll support this show in the process. So get started today. Create something great with Buzzsprout. All right, let's get into this week's show. So as I said, this is a fun one. I got a history lesson. I learned about a time at Hamilton that I didn't know very much about. And if you're a writer, this is a really good one. I always find myself being jealous of writers. It's like musicians and writers are things I'd love to be able to do well that I don't think that I can. So I'm jealous of them. And Mike shares a lot about his career in writing. First as a newspaper journalist at papers like the Journal News and the Stamford Advocate. Mike's feature stories and columns have appeared regularly over the course of his career in publications like the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Miami Herald, Newsday, hey, Long Island, my hometown paper, and many other U.S. newspapers. He's authored and co-authored many books, and he's written even more that he doesn't get credit for as a ghostwriter, which he talks about, which I think is really interesting. And then he went and created a podcast about writing, Paid by the Word, where he talks to people in the profession. So there's a lot of good stuff in here. I hope you enjoy it. Here is my conversation with Mike Barlow, class of 1975.
Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Okay, good. All right, then then whenever you want to go.
Yeah, I mean, I hit record before you join, and
Good.
we get rolling. So I just go into it. So thank you for spending some of your Friday night with me. I appreciate it.
No, I love your podcast. I particularly like the jazz intro. That just really brings me back to the 1970s, which of course is I'm a child of, I was born in 1952,
Yeah.
but I feel as though I came of age in the 1970s, which was when I was at Hamilton College.
Yeah.
So that 70s show is all about my my cohort.
Oh, that's funny. Well, it's as I said to you when I was emailing you, it's an era of the school that is woefully underrepresented as part of this show so far. So I'm happy to talk to more people from your time period.
And it's too bad in a lot of ways. And now I'll explain why. One is that while the dawning of the age of Aquarius officially took place in the 1960s,
it
didn't really become manifest. It didn't become a real thing until the 1970s. And so I graduated from high school in 1970, and we were kind of like the last class of kids who didn't do drugs. Get to Hamilton, and all of a sudden it's like, we're doing drugs and we're all hippies. And that made a big difference, because no one told us that was our role in life, is to be this, it was a very, very sharp, transformation, and nobody prepared us for that. That you're going to go from being, short-haired kids who are just basically preparing for the draft, to long-haired hippies who are spending most of your time, smoking pot.
And that was the vibe on campus. I mean, that was.
Oh yeah, and then because that, and I think that were the the vibe, if that's the right word, was amplified by the presence of Kirkland College, which none of I can say that it was I miss Kirkland because some of my best friends were at Kirkland and continue to be. I'm really blessed. I feel so happy that I still know Kirkland graduates, and I count them among my best friends. But at the time, Hamilton, we were woefully, now I'm just talking about the guys at Hamilton, we were definitely not prepared for those kinds of social interactions. One, because we were at that time, again, and now I will just kind of segue into the concept of the sexual revolution. That was something that was talked about on television and in the newspapers and Time Magazine and Newsweek and all that stuff, and the Saturday Evening Post. But in real life, it didn't start until 1970. And so suddenly, and then it was accelerated by Roe v. Wade. So we were right there when the sexual revolution happened, and that was to call it a mixed blessing would be, it was complicated and it was difficult. And,
what was difficult? Why was it difficult?
Well, one was that first of all, it was completely unfair in the sense that if you were a guy, there wasn't a lot that you had to think about. But if you're a woman, it was much more complicated, because now you were responsible basically for taking care of yourself. Everybody, had a copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves. I shouldn't say everybody. Everyone at Kirkland had a copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves, and they were very, very self-aware. And then, of course, all of us idiots at Hamilton were woefully unaware of all this stuff. And so you had a society that was saying, okay, we're having this sexual revolution. You should all be having sex now and smoking pot, and not paying attention to your professors. And this created all kinds of what's the word for it? Cognitive dissonances. It's like, that's kind of not really, that's the understatement of the century, because first of all, the reason why we were at Hamilton is because most of us were really good students and we really wanted to study, so our ideas when we graduated from high school were not, we're going to spend the next or in my case, 5 years, smoking pot and trying to have sex all the time. That was not why we went to Hamilton. Also, we were aware of the fact that the Hamilton professors were really cool, but this is what they didn't tell us, was that there were a large group of Hamilton professors who had been canned from the State Department in the late 1940s and early 1950s because they had been part of they had helped fight the war in Asia. So it turned out that a lot of the history professors at Hamilton had been part of the effort to try to fight against the Japanese, because it was a hard fight. Yeah. And they were parachuted or delivered into China and in some cases into Vietnam to help organize military, small, guerrilla military organizations to fight the Japanese. So this is really cool right up until the McCarthy era started. And then all those guys, because they were basically seen as proto-communists, all got fired. And a lot of them wound up at small colleges like Hamilton, Colgate, you name it. And we were really fortunate as we had a bunch of them here, and they were all kind of like, somewhat secretive, because they didn't go around, advertising themselves. Oh, I got fired from the State Department, Right. But that, if you were lucky enough to be taking one of the courses in Asian history, you found out about all this stuff. So now it was bad enough that you were worrying. And again, this is me, right? So I was born in 1952, and I became of draft age in 1971, right when I was, a sophomore at Hamilton. And so all you were thinking about was the draft. And suddenly, beer and sex became secondary to, I don't want to get shot. And I realized that this doesn't sound very patriotic, but we were like 19-year-olds and we had other things on our minds.
Yeah. Then how much of that cast a shadow over
totally
campus for
totally. Yeah. If you weren't thinking about that, then you had some really good drugs. but I don't know anybody that wasn't concerned about their draft, their status in the draft.
Was it a constant conversation?
Oh yeah, that's all. I mean, for me, that's all we would talk about. Now I realize that, in some ways I'm a little bit of an outlier in Hamilton. So I went to public school. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. Mm-hmm. I went to public school in upstate New York. So I was not a rich kid. I was not a preppy. And, and I had not read Orlando Furioso or any of the other, Latin poems that I should have read before getting into English 21. But I'm really happy that, first of all, unquestionably, Hamilton prepared me. So I'm a writer, and there is no question in my mind that Hamilton prepared me above and beyond to be a more than competent writer. And that's all I've been doing for the last 40 years. That's how I live in Fairfield, Connecticut. Mm-hmm. People say, oh, you're a freelance writer, and how do you manage to live in Fairfield, Connecticut? And the secret sauce, the secret, ingredient, it was Hamilton College. Because at Hamilton College, if they didn't teach you anything else, they taught you how to write.
Right.
And because at the time you couldn't get out of the place unless you could write a decent essay. And because I was an English major, I could write more than decent essay. And I also, and because my mentor there, I had three great mentors actually. So Ivan Markey, Austin Briggs, and Dwight Lindley, all of whom. So Austin Briggs has got a reputation as an angel. Markey and Lindley were widely disparaged because they were very tough. But wow, if you could get through their classes, you knew how to write, and so it's almost like having a superpower. And I thank Hamilton for that.
So back to the fear of being drafted.
Sure.
I had a current student on last week talking about activism on campus, and we touched a little bit on the history of it. And obviously, the time you were at Hamilton in
Right.
the country at large, activism was rampant.
Yeah.
How much of an anti-war movement was happening? I mean, I know there was, obviously you said there's
Well,
concern about being drafted,
yeah.
but did you feel that was that an active part of campus life?
Right before I got there, the year before I got there was the moratorium, the student moratorium, where where students had occupied Root Hall, and that is one of the things that led to the deconstruction of that curriculum. And so I was really lucky. So you could ask, well, how did that affect you directly? Well, it meant that I could take any classes I wanted, and I know that your interviewee last week, or the one that I just listened to, mentioned that too, and I'm so that was such a blessing and such a great thing that Hamilton gave to us, and that was a direct. I know it's kind of weird, to say, like, and well, how did you benefit from the war in Vietnam? Well, I didn't have to take any classes that I didn't want to at Hamilton College. That sounds pretty weird, but that was a direct impact. And but it was a huge impact because because it made it possible for me to take classes that I really loved. And so I took a bunch of English classes. I took a bunch of Asian history classes. I took a bunch of art, and architecture classes and psychology classes. And I didn't have to take any classes that I didn't want to, and I think it gave us a sense that we were in control of our lives. And so, like, for instance, we were by the end of my freshman year, I was like a Marxist, like everybody, like many other people. I shouldn't say everybody, but like many of we were all like Marxists, And the thing is at Hamilton is we were like fake Marxists because you could actually find a professor who would, walk you through everything you needed to become a real Marxist. And then, like by sophomore year, when we decided that was not cool, and that Marxism actually doesn't work. And that it's a nice idea, but God forbid you should ever do it in real life. And I mean that seriously, and I feel, by the way, the same about socialism. Great idea. I love the idea. Don't try it. Don't try this at home. And that's, and by the way, for any of you out there who are saying, oh, he's a socialist, like, no, I'm not a socialist. And this is not a socialist country. And, the fact that we like to use taxes to build roads and airports and bridges doesn't make us socialists.
Right. Sure.
So there, and that's the great thing about Hamilton College is that you can, it's like, I'm not just saying that off the top of my head or something that I read in the New York Times. It's like I took a whole bunch of classes from really smart people who would be happy to get into arguments back and forth about this stuff.
Yeah.
So again, I'm sorry for turning this into a commercial for Hamilton College, but that's the great thing about it. It really gives you wow, does it give you a foundation? You have, it's just like, it's like I do Tai Chi now, and Tai Chi is all about balance. And, and Hamilton was kind of like that the early introduction. I wish I'd been doing Tai Chi at Hamilton, but I didn't discover it until 3 years ago. But
you had different ways to relax and
different ways to relax. Yeah. No, it was weird because, again, and people would say, you're up in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing to do at the time, except drink, what is it? Utica Club, Genesee, or whatever other crap you could get, and smoke pot. And so that you really felt as though you were on an asteroid that was in some bizarre, eccentric orbit around some star that you weren't quite sure, what was going to happen next. And you didn't know. And the best thing that you could hope was, well, I want to graduate and not get drafted, And the really weird thing is that it turned out that war ended. And what's really strange is now, 20 years later, the war in Afghanistan is ending. So we had no idea that, we thought it was weird that the war in Vietnam was going on for 7 years. It's, oh gosh,
right,
it's like, that's amazing,
Right.
And now we're just ending a 20-year war, So it's very, it's very weird. And
did you know students who would leave to go off, or?
There were no Hamilton students that I knew at the time
Gotcha.
who went. there. We were, there were Hamilton students who had been in Vietnam previously, and then of course afterwards there were Hamilton students who, who proudly served and who served, admirably in the armed forces. And that's the other weird thing is that of course, once you study history, you realize that it used to be that when you went to a school like Hamilton, that your next step was to be commissioned as an officer in the military. That was considered normal. So it's not a good thing that suddenly, wealthy white people suddenly decided that they didn't want to have anything to do with the military anymore. And also what was really weird was it was not a choice that was made entirely by us. A lot of it was made by our parents. And when I say our parents, I'm not talking about my parents. I mean, I was really surprised. It was like, I had a whole bunch of right-wing Republican friends whose parents just like you bent over backwards and, spent lots and lots of money to keep their kids out of the draft. So on the one hand, they're saying like, we support President Nixon, all this warmongering stuff, but then they were the ones who got the fantastic medical deferments, because there was a lot to say that there was a lot of hypocrisy at the time was another understatement. It was fascinating to me, and believe me, it was I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, so to me, like, there were worse things than Clinton in the middle of the winter. Clinton in the middle of the winter is not the greatest thing in the world. I think we can all of us in the Hamilton community can agree to that.
It's one thing we share no matter what year you were a graduate.
Yeah, exactly. But it's something that we all got through together. And now I don't, I'm going to just, my daughter graduated from Hamilton College in 13. And, and that's one of the things that now we have, we will always, there are lots of things we have to argue about, but one thing we have in common is we both put up with those winters, and somehow we got through them.
That's funny. So living through the experience as a parent, how did that experience compare to your time as a student? How did you've seen the school evolve quite a bit over time? Well,
you know what? In many ways, I was surprised by how much it hadn't changed.
Oh, interesting.
And that it was in a good and a bad way. So, I'll just say, as a parent, the bad way was it seems as though everybody is still drinking way too much beer. Okay. So there's that, but from the good part was just how focused everybody is on, learning and learning, learning academic stuff, learning about the world, learning new languages, learning about other cultures, learning sciences. That even though, because Hamilton was always like a tough school. It's like you really had to have a sense of commitment to get through it. And so what I saw in my daughter and her friends was that same sense of commitment, that same sense of toughness, and that same willingness to put up with all kinds of crap to get through. And so I really admired the kids because as it's like the winters are the winters, and the campus is much more pretty than it was when I was there in the 1970s. When I was in the 1970s, it was like everything was covered in vomit, Now it's like it's an absolutely gorgeous campus, and it's just, it's a miracle to me, and I think it's wonderful. That said, that harsh aspect of it is still there, and to me, that's a good thing. It's like you don't graduate from Hamilton College unless you've done your work.
Yeah.
And so like that. I know. Believe me, I was not planning on turning this into a commercial for Hamilton College.
Well, it kind of is anyway, so it's totally fine. That's basically what this whole thing's been about, I think.
Good.
School is my kids better go for free after all this.
Yeah. Hey,
I want to go back to Kirkland for a moment. So by the time you get there and go through it with your fellow classmates, the school had been somewhat established by then. The first graduating class had come and gone through their 4 years, a few years before you got there. So I imagine some of the disruption and adjustments since the launch of the school had settled. Curious what the to use your word balance, was there balance at that point when in your 4 years?
Hamilton was, I think there were 800 kids at Hamilton and about 400 students at Kirkland.
Yeah.
Maybe 900, but there was always there was a smaller number of kids at Kirkland.
Yep.
And the Hamilton, the Hamilton student body was much more upstate New York, guys with short hair,
right.
Who were, the children of bankers and stuff like that. The Kirkland community was very, was much more like Barnard College, and and that's what they were going for. And so that was it was not an easy relationship. And also the Kirkland curriculum was very different from the Hamilton curriculum.
Right.
So most of the friends that I made at Kirkland, for instance, were Kirkland students who were taking Hamilton classes. And if you were a Kirkland student, you could get through your entire career without taking a Hamilton class at all. And in fact, I know students now who I'm friendly with now, people my age, Kirkland students who took no Hamilton classes. I would characterize it as at the time as an uneasy relationship. I would say that the Hamilton men were not really ready to be challenged by intelligent,
interesting,
focused, self-confident women. The Hamilton, it's typical because here I have two kids, I have a boy and a girl, and so, I'm well aware of the differences between how boys and girls mature. And girls, mature, they get it much faster. Let's just face it, girls are smarter than boys. They are. I'm sorry. That's just the truth.
I'm married to a woman who's much smarter than I am, and I have an 8-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy, and I understand what you're talking
exactly.
about.
and it's just and it's just the way that's just the way it is. And so the idea, and I do think at the time when I reflect back on the guys at Hamilton, I'm talking about now the administrators and the board of directors, they do seem kind of clueless in retrospect as to, oh, by the way, boys and girls are not the same, because so basically you had a bunch of what I would consider to be fairly mature and intelligent young women and then a bunch of goofy guys, so you had 400 intelligent, mature women who were very kind of like cosmopolitan, and then 800 idiots from upstate New York. Sorry, I realize I'm like, but and I lived in upstate New York, and so I love upstate New York. Don't get me wrong. But so to answer your question, from my perspective, and I certainly hope that you will find somebody else to interview from my age.
I intend to.
Yeah, and say, Barlow doesn't know what he's talking about as usual. He didn't know what he was talking about in 1970, and he doesn't know what he's talking about now.
You mentioned the hippie vibe on campus when we first started chatting, and it's interesting then to hear you talk about the right-wing son of banker, short haircut men of Hamilton, because that's the image that's conjured for me when you think about the men of Hamilton and the history of the school. What I read about the school or the history of the school, it does seem to jump from the 1950s, short haircut men of Hamilton, and skips over this idea of a hippie vibe on campus. So I'm curious, is the hippie part that you're talking about that gravitated towards the Kirkland side of campus just because of what was coming out of Kirkland?
First of all, that's a great question, Dave, because it really gets at that. That's a complicated question, and there's a book there. No, I would say that there were the hippies at Hamilton. Were, and I count myself among them, were, we were hippies at Hamilton. And what does a hippie mean? It just means somebody who, one, was, grew their hair long, and then two, spent a fair amount of time smoking pot. So it could have been anybody, really. You didn't have to be, the fact that I was like a left-wing hippie I don't know what that means. And then the other weird thing is that of course there's so many nuances. Now, hey, I'm almost, if I live another, let's see, today is May, was May 7th. So my birthday is July 30th. If I live another 8 or 9 weeks, I'll be 69, and so I'm old enough now to know that everything is, it's all about the nuance. And so, nothing,
it's all gray. It's all gray area, right?
exactly right. Nothing is, there's neither black nor white.
Right.
So I would get into arguments at, or other here. It was very typical for me to completely ruin a party by talking about how interested I was in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, because I was a real NASA fan, and they go, oh, but you're against the military, and and NASA is just trying to colonize the moon. And I go, no, and then I would wait, and they would go, I can't believe it. Why did you say that? We were just about to, get invited to stay over, and I said, one, we were not about to be invited to stay over. And two, it's like, I was a Star Trek fan. So it's like, I was like, to me, space travel was good.
Was being a writer the plan?
No, absolutely not. But thank you for asking. Because this is important. I did not want to be a writer because I was one of those kids who, from the time I was like 2 years old, people were always telling, you're going to be a writer. Oh, Michael, I know what you're going to be when you grow up. You're going to be a writer. So naturally, after I heard that for the 39th time, I said, if there's one thing I'm not going to be, it's a writer. And so my goal when I got to Hamilton was to be an experimental psychologist, and to be the first psychologist in space. Again, getting back to NASA, my goal was to be an astronaut. And gradually, as it became obvious that I did not have the temperament to be a scientist, by the time I finally got around to graduating, so basically, and this is a whole other thing. We had gone to France. I had a friend whose father really did not want him to be drafted. So he arranged for both of us to go to France for a while. And so, when I got back from there, at that point, I had to play catch up. And the only thing that I could do really well that I knew that I could catch up in was English. And luckily, and Austin Briggs and Markey and Lindley said, the worst things than graduating, from Hamilton College as an English major. And why don't you just do it? And then that way, at least you're going to graduate, and you might even get honors, which I did. Huh. And which was a miracle to me. It was like, because I think that's the other weird thing. It's like people, wait a second, you had a C- average, but you graduated with departmental honors in English. How did you do that? And the answer is, I read a couple of Thomas Hardy books and I wrote a really good essay. And that, kind of like set me on my life's course after that. I did, I will say that I did become a pilot. And again, I do feel that my,
so not quite didn't make it quite to space, but still got up there.
But I've been the great thing is that then when you meet, so this is the nice thing about being a journalist, is that you meet, pilots who have gone into space, and you do meet astronauts. And as soon as they find out that you're a private pilot and you fly Cessnas, then it's like everything is the same, and then they talk to you, oh man, it's like, because the one thing that all pilots have in common that they don't generally tell them, so now I'm going to let this, like the magicians tell you a secret, is we're all nauseous and afraid. So it's like any pilot, we were all, that's like the, I have friends who were Blue Angels, the Navy Blue Angels, who are the best pilots in the world. And it's just like, hot, nauseous, and scared. It's like, but then you do it anyway.
I always wonder when I see commercial pilots, because I assume that most of them had, more experience than just flying commercial jets, and those things seem to fly themselves these days anyway. That it must be boring for these. I mean, they must be just dying for some sort of emergency to let the real piloting skills kick in.
It's true. I know. That's why Sully was such a,
Yeah,
and
right.
that the truth is that's why it's so easy. It turns out to get a conversation going with commercial pilots and military pilots and even astronauts, because they want to talk to you about, like, wow, you fly a Cessna 152. It's like the size of a phone booth. It's like, yeah, and it hasn't changed. There is something really nice about flying. I mean, flight is a wonderful thing, and it's a transcendent experience, and I recommend it to anybody who has the time and the energy to do it. But I also recommend meditation. So that's something, and I would say, so I took my first yoga class at Hamilton. And of course, the reason why was because it was a good way to meet Kirkland students, because the yoga class was given at Kirkland. But I'm happy to say that I stuck with it. So that was like 1970. So what is this, like 100 years later? Obviously, I'm not a math major. It feels like 100 years later. I'm still doing yoga, qigong, tai chi, and meditation, and I recommend it highly to everybody. I know it sounds kind of silly, but mindfulness will really help you, particularly in these stressful times that we live in.
Yeah.
Because they're just, and again, that I just always felt that Hamilton prepared me to lead a life of goofiness, but also occasional bouts of discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Goofiness interspersed with discipline, and I think that describes Hamilton pretty well. Yes, we were drunk a lot, but we also knew how to study.
Right.
And kind of in a weird way, meditation is like that. You can't be completely like chill all the time, or else you wouldn't be able to pay the bills.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to know how to take those moments, take those minutes, and turn off all the noises in
Pull
your
yourself
mind.
out of the craziness for a minute and
Yeah, turn off
settle
all the
yourself. Yeah.
voices, all the weird stuff, and just be yourself and be happy, because yourself, you're basically, again, and that's the other cool. What was so great about Hamilton also was that I really felt like it was like you were living in a time warp. That sense of the past was inescapable, and that's something that I miss.
Even in those some of those real old buildings on campus, those are my favorite buildings to have classes in, because it felt like you were going back in time, and this, the students who were there in the, in the early days of the school were sitting in these same seats. Probably the desks were probably the same age as the building,
Yeah,
but there wasn't a right angle in some of these buildings, and you could
it's
feel it,
true. Yeah,
and feel like you were part of the past there. Yeah.
the library was there were a lot of buildings that were under pressure.
So talk to me about what was happening after school. You graduate, and then what was the journey?
Oh, well, I graduated in 1975, which
Yeah.
was right into an incredible recession. That was those were the days of the OPEC uh, induced gas
Yeah,
crisis.
long lines and
So we had the lines, and gas went up to, I don't know, 35 cents a gallon. Oh gosh, because it had been 15 cents a gallon, and so now it's 35 or 50 cents a gallon, and people were freaking out, and rightfully so, because people weren't earning that much money back then.
Sure.
And also there just wasn't any gas, and so those were kind of dark days. And also Hamilton College at that time, I know this is something else that the kids today won't believe, but there was no one in Hamilton to talk to about getting a job. If you ask somebody at Hamilton about, and how can I use my, English to get a job, they looked at you like, I'm sorry, are you a gentleman or aren't you? It's like they were real. There was, even the cool people at Hamilton thought it was uncool to talk about money, you know? And so that's something, thank goodness, that has changed.
Yeah. Wow.
That's like, and part of it is like the parents won't put up with that crap anymore, because everyone understands that one way or the other, you need to have a job.
Yeah.
And the idea that, and so back when I was there, now, and I'm not kidding about this. The you It was considered like rude to be talking about how I'm going to turn this education into a career.
That's incredible.
I know it is. It's absolutely incredible, and that's the one thing. I mean, I'm not even I'm beyond. Luckily I'm long gone. Like I'm not upset or angry about it anymore. But it was like, and these are even like the great professors, even the ones that I'm not going to mention any names, but it's like they look at you like, you expect to get a job out of this? It's like, dude, you spent the last 4 years learning Elizabethan poetry. Aren't you thankful for that? And that's its own reward. And so that was not good. So at any rate, so I graduated in 1975 into this recession, and I wound up, to answer your question, I know this is going to sound incredibly romantic, but it wasn't. I played in a bar band, a rock and roll band. I played lead guitar in a rock and roll band for about 3 years. And you want to talk about some demoralizing stuff, get an English major, an honors English major from Hamilton College, playing, an upstate, New York bar band. So I can say that if you ever need somebody to come by and play Sunshine for Your Love, Sunshine of Your Love, Sunshine of Your, or any of that stuff. Yes. I can still get into arguments over the proper voicing of the chords for, old Rolling Stones songs. But then luckily, or no, whatever, at one point my dad slipped a classified ad under my door, and it said that the local newspaper, the Times Herald Record, which was owned by the Wall Street Journal, was looking for editorial assistants, and I got that job, and I've been working steadily in journalism ever since then. And being a newspaper reporter is I was in daily newspaper journalism for 18 years, and it was a wonderful career. And that, between Hamilton teaching you how to write, and then 18 years of being forced to write 2 or 3 stories a day, you really learn how to write. And it's like now I feel like I'm bulletproof, at least in terms of writing.
Does writing at a newspaper as a journalist, does that somehow help potential writer's block? Because there's writer's block's not allowed, right? You're on deadline, you got to write. So does that train your brain to just write?
Yes. It's definitely like, no, it doesn't exist, because you wouldn't last, 2 days. And that's the good thing about, like, having, well, it's a little Nietzschean. Sorry for getting all intellectual. But yeah, it's a Hamilton thing. So Nietzsche wrote about, you have to find the bottom, and for me, I found that bottom, and as I mentioned before, it's like, it was, the last thing I want to do is be a writer. Well, I had no money. I owed a lot of money. Some of the people I owed money to were unpleasant. And I said, all right, I need to get a real job, even if it's a job at a newspaper. And it turned out that was my salvation, and that's when you're down there at rock bottom, that's when you find out, what's good in the world. Because everything from that point on, if you have an optimistic spirit, if you believe that good things can happen, then things do. And I basically wrote my way out of, a fairly serious depression, and I wrote my way into the rest of and I've just been writing for the last 40 years. And I haven't stopped writing. And it's, first of all, I love writing. That was the other thing, is that one of the reasons why people would always say to me when I was a kid, oh, you're going to be a writer, was because that they knew that I loved writing. I just didn't want to admit that to myself.
Right. Because,
it's like,
how long did it take for you to accept that and really recognize that?
Well, until I was like 28. I think.
Wow.
So I graduated, and then I was playing in a rock and roll band for a while, and then I worked in an advertising agency. I was actually really fortunate. I got a chance to work in an advertising agency it was the first ad agency run and owned by women. So that was a fantastic experience. So
what was it called?
It was called Advertising to Women, ATW. And I will spare you. I won't do the songs that we did, but we did. And this is so we did the Aviance commercial. That was one of our favorite. Prince Machiavelli. Aviance was a fragrance by Prince Machiavelli, and there was an actress who took off her rubber gloves, and it was considered very, remarkably, over the top for the mid 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Again, what's really weird is that the 1970s, I thought, when I look back, those were the most amazing, transformational, passionate, energetic days certainly of my life. That period of time when I was at Hamilton College, and then right up until Reagan was elected. The 1970s were a time of continual change and tumult, and they were very exciting. And I'm glad that at least there was one TV show, that 70s show, that kind of suggested that there's something about the 1970s that's worth looking back at. Sure, yeah, they were dark and weird, but it was also a time of great energy. Mm-hmm. And great music too. I mean, Steely Dan.
Great movies too.
Great movie. Oh yeah, fantastic movies. All great movies. But to answer your question again, it took me a long time to accept the fact that writing was my salvation, but it was, and I'm glad that I did it. And that's the thing is, it's not. And now, for anyone who's listening really carefully who wants to be a writer, the secret is really simple. Write in short, declarative sentences. Start with a noun, then your verb, then your object. So always start with the subject, verb, object. You can't go wrong. Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Nora Ephron and Dorothy Parker, all the great writers followed this, basic pattern. It's great to read Shakespeare. Don't try to write like Shakespeare. And if you need more coaching on that, you can find me easily. I'm happy to, if anybody needs coaching in writing, I'm here for you.
Interesting.
You can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and I'm easy to find.
Or they could listen to your podcast.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I'd forgotten. I also do a podcast now. Yes. Thank you so much, Dave. I do a podcast called Paid by the Word, and it's interviews with other cranky old journalists. So if you want to find out what it's like to live a life in journalism, and here now I have to do a pitch and a plug for Had I Known, because Dave is the one who mentored and inspired me when I was starting my podcast. And I really owe so much to Dave. He was extremely gracious and patient, and he shared his knowledge with me. And that's what it's kind of all about. That's why, Hamilton really is a community, because we've all been through like a lot of the same stuff. And it's like we kind of, even though I've never met Dave in real life, and maybe I never will. And that's also what's cool about what I love about this particular moment on the 21st century. Some of my best friends now are like in Estonia, mm-hmm. Or they're in Portland, Oregon, and I may never actually meet them in person, and that's okay. I teach my classes now. I teach a public speaking class at University of Bridgeport, and everybody goes, "Oh, how can you teach a class on Zoom?" And it's, what, it's not that hard if you kind of lean into it a little bit, mm-hmm. and if you just put your heart and your soul into it, you can work miracles over Zoom.
Yeah, it's opening up a lot, and a lot of this isn't going to change.
Yeah, exactly. Dave, thank you so much, because without your help, I would never have been able to launch Paid by the Word, and I'm sincere about that. I really, really thank you.
It was my pleasure, and I have I have to be honest. So after you and I chatted, and you launched the show, and congratulations, I think it's great. And I listened to the first episode, and I went, "Son of a bitch, it sounds better than mine." The intro's great. You have that woman's lovely voice doing the intro. I'm like,
here's the perfect example. Zoe Ether is like a leading. So I met her because I wrote a book about smart cities. I wrote a book called Smart Cities, Smart Future. And Dave, I'll show this to you. Your viewers won't be able to see it. So that's the other cool thing about Hamilton is it's like, yeah, sure. Why not write a book? It's like, hey, I went to Hamilton College. Why not? So I've actually written 30 books. This is a whole other thing. So I'm also for everybody. So this is a little weird. I'm like probably the most famous ghostwriter you've never heard of. And that's how, so about halfway through, so about 20 years ago, I stopped being a journalist and my byline disappeared. But I was able to, continue to pay the mortgage. And my kids briefly said, Dad, we don't see your name in the paper anymore. And I said, yes, but now we have, a car that doesn't break down every 15 minutes. Is that weird? Yeah, I think it's weird being a ghostwriter, but it has gotten me through the last 20 years. And what I do is when I get a little bit ahead, then I write a book under my own name. So I've written a book called Learning to Love Data Science, which was one of the first books about data science. And now everybody is like, a data science, well, that's not a big deal. Yeah, and that's because I wrote a book about it.
And are these topics, so smart cities or data science, are these passion subjects for you, or what? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So those are things like, I had, I am passionate about data science. I know that sounds a little weird, but it's just like being passionate about grammar.
I'm curious, the two passion projects, two topics you're interested in writing books about, but then all of the ghostwriting you've done, I imagine there's times where you're writing about topics that weren't necessarily passionate topics for you. How do you power through that?
Yeah, I try to find, ideally what I do is I find the passion in there, in other words, like being a ghostwriter is a lot like being an actor in that you become someone else.
Do you try to channel their voice? Do you try to get a sense for?
I do. I definitely, and I particularly enjoy writing for women because that gives me an opportunity to write in the voice of a woman and to embody that. And just like an actor, you extend yourself and you learn through the experiences of people. In other words, most of my clients are really smart, really successful, and really, high energy people. They just happen to not be people who can write. So I'm not under any illusions that I'm smarter than them. In many cases, they're smarter than I am. And so I can learn a lot from them. Like, for instance, I just wrote, and I don't think she can, I just wrote a book called Power Economics for Elena Cahill, who is a wonderful person who I really admire. She is just like, the bomb. And this gave me an opportunity to write about the economics of decarbonization. And you might say, well, and that's not something I would have written about. I would not have chosen to write about, how easy it is to save the world if we just ratcheted down our use of carbon a little bit, but very broadly. In other words, we don't have to turn every light off, but we do have to turn off a lot of lights, and we just have to replace a lot of lights with more efficient lights. And we do have to replace like all of our cars with electric cars. That's a big deal. Like, it's like electric cars are not just something cool. Electric cars are going to save us. This is a really big deal. And so I've now become, so not only was I was kind of like semi-passionate, obviously, about, I never, as a progressive liberal, of course, I'm in favor of doing everything I can to fight against global warming and climate change.
Sure.
Right? But I never would have learned the how specifically to do it unless I had written the book.
I see.
So that's where, so I'm really, really grateful to, to clients like Elena who give me an opportunity to learn about something and to be someone else.
Yeah.
During that period of time.
And what's the process? Are you punching up things that they've written, or are you just talking through it with them and then writing based on conversations? How does that work?
My technique is that I interview them and I interview other experts. So I look at all these. So basically, all of my books are basically they're long form narrative nonfiction. They're basically just like really long newspaper stories. Because the truth is, that's the only thing that I know how to write. And some editors that I've worked with have kind of derisively said, "Oh, I can tell you're a journalist." And it's like, why? Because I use multiple sources and I footnote things and I try to write accurate stuff. I don't know, which is not necessarily, but anyway. So, so I'm definitely not. This is definitely not Shakespeare. What it is I'm trying to gather as many interesting facts as possible and harnessing them to create an argument that will get people to say, for instance, be more careful about their use of energy, and to, if they have a choice between using energy that's generated by through burning carbon fuels, that they'll say, no, I can do this just as easily using solar or wind, or geothermal, or hydropower. In other words, you do have choices. And then what's really weird, and of course, what's really funny is you find out how fascinating. Like, for instance, Texas. We here in the Northeast, we just tend to look at Texas as like, oh, those cowboys. They're always going to be doing the weird. Texas is the leader in solar and wind power. And when you actually get to Texans, they will tell you that. Now that is part of the problem. And this is now I'm about to go on a rant about journalism. Journalism has become so polarized, just like everything else. Journalism has become politicized, and that's something. If you are a journalist, please fight against this. Do not, there is a reason why we used to call it objective journalism. There's nothing wrong with being right in the middle, being in the middle of the road. You have two sources on one side, two sources on the other side. Let the reader figure out what's accurate. Do not, if MSNBC is just as bad as Fox News, is just as bad as CNN. They're all awful at this point. Please, if you're doing journalism, do multiple sources and go right down the middle. Your readers, your viewers, they will find the truth.
Yeah.
So, yes. Hamilton, reading comic books in Newark, New Jersey, Hamilton, writing about Shakespeare and Elizabethan poetry in Hamilton College, and then learning how to, to create a balanced, multiple source story in journalism and for newspapers, because that used to be the standard.
Yeah.
It has enabled me now to write books that people read and pay me to write. Or if I write a book by myself, they'll buy the book.
Yeah.
And it's a career. So was Hamilton good for me? Yes.
And then looking back across that arc that you just talked about, is there anything you wish you had known? Oh,
yes. Accept yourself for what you are. The sooner you do that, I think the better. I wish that I had accepted the fact that I was a good writer and that was something that I should do. I think I could have skipped over 15 years of unnecessary torment. In other words, if you are good at something, there's no reason not to make that your livelihood.
All right, that's Mike Barlow, class of 1975. When I was planning my conversation with Mike, he raised a concern that he may only have about 40 minutes of interesting things to say. And I got to tell you, as I was going through that conversation with him, I could have stayed on Zoom with him for several hours. He was chock full of stories, chock full of insight, and any number of the things that we were talking about, I would have liked to have gone deeper with him, whether it was Hamilton in the 1970s, his career as a newspaper journalist, his career just as an author, as a ghostwriter. All of those things are rich topics and could have been an hour-long conversation in and of themselves. I continue to say that the thing I enjoy most about doing this show is getting to meet so many different people, so many interesting people. And Mike certainly fits the bill on that one, and I was thankful to get a chance to talk to him. His podcast is Paid by the Word. You can get it wherever you get podcasts. A former guest of this show, Adam Hirschfield, fellow Hamilton alum, was a recent guest on the show. Check that one out. Check them all out. They're great. And there's a link in the show notes for Mike's page on Amazon where you can check out some of the books he's written. My thanks to Mike Barlow for joining this week. Really appreciate it. You have been listening to Had I Known on WHCL-FM, Clinton, New York. HadIKnown.buzzsprout.com. Had I Known Show on social media. As always, my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying the music on this show. And once again, Doc is going to play us out. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll talk to you next week.
Had I Known podcast show on your radio or take it to go.